Hi guys, welcome to Carpool Book Review. I'm Chris from Viva Books, and today I'm very lucky to have with me the author of 10 Rogues, Peter Grose. Hello Peter.
I'm lucky to be here too, Chris.
Oh,
thank you very much for having me.
How are you?
I'm in good form, thank you.
And how was lunch?
Lunch was excellent. I wasn't expecting Indonesian food, but nasi goreng like I haven't had in 15 years, so it was fantastic.
Wow, that's great to hear. There you go, folks. There's a local diner for you.
Absolutely. Yep.
I think it was the Hummingbird, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, fantastic. Yes, so Peter, this book, 10 Rogues, fantastic, great history.
Thank you.
Something I think all Australians should read.
Yes.
So tell us about this book of yours.
Well, I'm going to just say something first up.
Yep.
You say all Australians should read. I got really angry when I was writing this book.
Oh, did you?
And I'll tell you why. Because there was stuff I wasn't taught in school
Yes.
that I should have been.
Yes.
And in particular, the connection between the slave trade and the transportation of convicts is something
Yes.
that ought to be in every history textbook in Australia, and it's not. And it's a terrible story because what used to happen was, first, transportation of convicts. The English got this completely balmy idea into their heads that there was a criminal class, and if you could
Yes.
kind of isolate them and remove them, there'd be no more crime.
Yeah.
Well, this didn't work out terribly well, but and nor did it ever have any chance of working out. But nevertheless, that's what they believed. And so they began the process of transportation, which was really exile in a new clothing.
Yep.
And they began this process of transportation in the early 18th century, early 17th century, I'm wrong. And they were transporting criminals to the American colonies, particularly to Kentucky and Virginia.
Yes.
And we in Australia are used to the idea of transportation of convicts. They're sent and they're in a jail when they get there, or they're on a chain gang when they get there, and they're guarded by soldiers, or they're all in a barracks and they're all being hemmed in and looked after. That was not true in the United States. What happened to the convicts in the United States was totally appalling. They were sold.
So like slaves.
Like slaves.
Like slaves.
Like
as if slavery isn't bad enough.
Yes, but the terrible thing is they were cheaper than slaves. And your average slave, black slave, cost of the order of £24 at the period. And that's
a lot in those days.
Well,
isn't
it was. It's very hard to translate it accurately.
Yeah.
But as good a figure as you'll get is to say that £24 in those days is about $25,000 today. So slaves weren't cheap.
No.
And
didn't actually understand that. That was one of the things I picked in the book, and I went, whoa.
Yes, slaves weren't cheap.
Yeah.
But the convicts were cheaper, and that was one of the reasons they were attractive. And so a skilled convict might fetch, let's say, £15 as against the £24 for a black slave.
Yeah.
And an unskilled convict might fetch £10, and women were half price. This story is so totally appalling you can't believe that it ever happened, but this is what happened. So these guys are sent over there, and they're simply sold to the highest bidder. They're sold in Britain by the boatload.
God.
A boatload of convicts costs you about 500 quid.
So by whom? By the government?
By the government.
Good Lord.
All the government wants to do is get rid of them, get them out of there.
Yeah.
And so the government says, righto, I've got a fine boatload of convicts here for anyone who wants it. £500 buys this lot here.
Wow.
And you could then sell them for the prices I've quoted. £15 for a skilled convict, £10 for unskilled.
That's appalling.
Well, insofar as there were of the order of 250 convicts to the boatload, there was a jolly nice sum of money to be had from getting into this business. So that continued right up until 1776, when the Americans threw the British out. And so the British were told in no uncertain terms by the Americans, no more convicts.
Yeah.
Hold the criminals. We've got plenty of criminals of our own. We don't need yours. And so stop. So suddenly...
Got enough of our own, thank you.
1776. We're fine for criminals here. And so 1776, from that point onwards, there's nowhere to send the convicts, because they were simply sent to the American colonies.
Yeah.
And so James Cook, as we well know, had discovered, if that's the right word. I mean, given that he arrived somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 years later than the Aboriginals.
Yes.
But nevertheless, Captain Cook discovered the east coast of Australia. And so Cook had said this is empty, again ignoring the Aboriginals.
Yeah.
And so the British thought, well, this is a fine place to send criminals. They can build a colony there to the greater glory of the British Empire, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. They were sent out to Australia, and they were sent, as they had been in America, in multiples of 7 years. That was the common sentence. So you got sentenced to 7 years transportation, or 14 years transportation, or transportation for life, because life expectancy was lower at the time.
Yeah.
And out you went, and there you stayed. And so the whole convict system was really brought about by the American War of Independence. And without the American War of Independence, none of the facts of my book would ever have happened. Anyway, there was another factor at the time, and this goes back to the facts that made me angry that I wasn't taught them. 1788 will start with the British First Fleet that brings the convicts out from 1787 to 1788 is run by the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy, that's fine, you know, it runs under Royal Navy discipline, so the convicts are treated not much worse than the sailors, which is to say pretty badly, but not much worse than the sailors. But the Royal Navy jacked up, and the Royal Navy said, oh, look, you know, we're going to be fighting Napoleon any minute now. We can't be carting convicts halfway around the world and fight Napoleon.
No.
So you blokes are going to have to make up your mind. So the British did what they've subsequently done. It was thought that Thatcher invented it, not a bit of it. It was much earlier. And they simply privatised the transportation of convicts. And in the slavers, who were then under pressure, I mean, there was a lot of anti-slavery sentiment around towards the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, and so the slavers had to reposition themselves in the marketplace, and so they thought, oh righto, this transportation of convicts sounds like a good lark, and we've got ships with manacles below decks, and we're pretty experienced in transporting the unwilling across thousands of miles of ocean, so that's what we'll do. So the slavers, in effect, took over the transportation of convicts. And the second fleet, which came to Australia, and the first fleet arrived, as we know well enough, in 1788. The second fleet arrived in 1790.
Right.
And it was under the auspices, not of the Royal Navy, but of a company called Camden, Calvert and King, who had been the biggest slavers in London. There were three great slaving cities in Britain, if great's the right word, and that was London, Bristol and Liverpool. And they were the biggest slavers in London. They had plantations in the West Indies. They were just a big conglomerate. Yeah. And so they got the contract for the second fleet. And so in 1790 or thereabouts, they loaded a bit over 1,000 healthy convicts in Portsmouth in England and set off to transport them to New South Wales. Well, some a bit under 300, but that's like 3 out of 10 died on the journey. Now, this was not necessarily bad news for Camden, Calvert and King, because they were paid by the convict loaded, not by the convict landed breathing. And so the convicts' rations could be hoovered up and sold when they got there. And that's what they did, or the captains of the ships did. So they would open little markets when they arrived, and thus would they dispose of the rations, etc., of the convicts who'd sadly passed away on the journey out.
And we think greed for the mighty dollar is a modern day thing.
No, but there it all was. So I wasn't taught that at school, and I should have been. I passed that on.
No. And then we come to a bloke named Jimmy Porter.
Right. Well, Jimmy is my central figure in the book. And Jimmy, he'd been, as a kid in London, he'd got into a bit of trouble with the law, aged about 12. And so he was sent off to sea, which was going to A, make a man of him, and B, straighten him out. And so off he went in a ship owned by his uncle. And he made it, having several ships later, he made it as far as Chile, to the port of Valparaiso. And there he met and married subsequently a girl called Narcissa Martel. And I mean, this again seems sort of bizarre, but there was a fashion in Chile at the time for rich girls to marry English sailors. This was thought to be marrying up. Well, why anyone would think marrying Jimmy Porter was marrying up is entirely beyond me, but nevertheless, that's what happened. And so Narcissa and Jimmy were married, and Narcissa's parents, who were wealthy, gave the young couple a ranch just outside Valparaiso in Chile. And so Jimmy, for 2 years, Narcissa bore him 2 children, one of whom died, but for 2 years Jimmy lived the life of a Chilean rancher, and that must have been a fairly comfortable and contented life.
Yeah.
But Jimmy spent the most part of his life with his thumb jammed down on the self-destruct button, and so he announced to his wife that he felt he needed one more voyage at sea, just to make his life complete. So against the furious opposition of his wife, understandable, and of his in-laws, also understandable, he set off for sea, and he got as far as Peru, where he got into fairly serious trouble and had to beat it out of Peru in a big hurry, jumping onto a British ship which transported him to London. And there he fell into bad company, was caught stealing, and was sentenced to transportation for life to Van Diemen's Land. Now, the other thing that I don't know, I know that you've read the book, Chris.
Yeah.
But did you know about Sarah Island before?
No,
you read the
I
book?
didn't actually. That was the other one of my questions for you.
Right.
Is because initially I thought when you spoke of it, it was Van Diemen's Land, but then obviously it isn't. It's an island off.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's right over on the west coast, so that there are high mountains and heavily wooded mountains, as anyone who's driven there will know.
Yeah.
And the idea was that Sarah Island was escape-proof, and you couldn't cross the mountains. There were no tracks through them. You'd never find your way. So Jimmy and this Sarah Island was an appalling place. I mean, it's daily floggings and infrequent, but nevertheless occasional hangings and so on. So it was just a terrible, terrible place, and the convicts were starved, and they were badly clothed and badly housed, and they were unhealthy, and they were overworked, and it was just a horrible, horrible, horrible place.
Yeah.
And so Jimmy, and it was reserved for people who'd reoffended, or the other thing the authorities really hated was escape. And so if you tried to escape, then Sarah Island was for you, and you got sent off there. And so Jimmy was sent to Sarah Island as part of all this. Now, Sarah Island had 2 things. It was to be a place of punishment, as we've just described,
Yep.
but it had another thing going for it. There's a particular tree which is unique to Tasmania called the Huon pine.
Oh yes. Yeah.
And this turned out to be the best ships building timber in the world. It was
Yeah.
light, and it was strong,
Yeah.
and it was particularly resistant to marine borers and things like that.
Yeah.
All the kind of creepy crawlies that eat your ship if you're not careful.
All absent.
And so the convict's job was to cut down Huon pine, float it down the Gordon River into Macquarie Harbour, and then it would be transported round to Hobart and turned into ships. And it's hard for us in 2020 to think about this, but the fact of the matter is that good shipbuilding timber was strategic material. It was like uranium.
Yeah, right.
And if you had good shipbuilding timber, then you had good ships, and they won wars, and they captured territory, and they defended trade routes. So good shipping timber was incredibly important. And the Huon pine turned out to be shipping timber like you couldn't find anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
Now, the only problem with all this was that Macquarie Harbour, where they were floating the logs down, had an appalling entrance with a bar, and shallow and difficult. And so if you loaded a ship up with lots of Huon pine, and these logs could weigh up to 12 tons. I mean, these trees were there before Julius Caesar was a lad, and so big trees. We're talking big trees here.
Yeah.
And if you loaded a ship up with these logs, then it sank ever deeper into the water until it wouldn't cross the bar. And so, on the other hand, you could load a ship up lightly with these logs, in which case you needed an awful lot of ships to transport the logs around to Hobart to build vessels with them. So somebody had one of those light bulb moments, and they suddenly thought, why don't we build the ships here? No need to transport the logs. We'll sail them across the bar. So master shipbuilders were brought to bear, and they taught the convicts the craft of shipbuilding. And this was a fantastic success. At one point, Sarah Island was the most successful shipbuilding yard in Australia.
Wow.
But there were other things that happened simultaneously. I mean, there were various pressures, but one of them was the shipbuilders themselves, who said, could you go a bit easy on flogging these blokes? Because they don't work terribly well after you flog them, and we need them. So the authorities took some note of this and said, oh yeah, okay, we'll go a bit easy. We'll just cool it a bit. And so the number of floggings went down. The master shipbuilders insisted that the convicts who worked in the shipbuilding force be an elite, so they were better fed, better clothed, better housed, and better looked after generally. And as a result of all this, discipline improved out of all recognition, to the point where the number of floggings went down by 90%.
Wow.
And
surprise,
suddenly,
surprise.
This hellhole that was Sarah Island became a really rather pleasant place. It's the point where there's one wonderful story. There's a particular convict, and I have to remind you that you know, this was a really nasty place to be. This particular convict had been working on 2 ships, and he finished his sentence, so he's a free man. And he said to the people on Sarah Island, could I stay on a couple of months and just finish these 2 ships, because I don't want to just walk away from them. So it was transformed to that extent. So this didn't suit the great and good Governor Arthur over in Hobart, who was a hanger and flogger to his fingertips. And so Arthur kept sending messages to Sarah Island saying, how's the flogging going? You know, it doesn't seem to be going terribly well. You know, you haven't flogged nearly enough blokes lately. So Arthur thought they'd all gone soft over there. And he agreed that the convict colony should be wound down on Sarah Island. They should all be moved to Port Arthur, and that would be that. And this was a particularly unpopular decision with the convicts. So the British Colonial Secretary decreed that there should be any unfinished project should be completed before the settlement was cleared. And so 10 convicts were left behind, because there was one unfinished project, which is a brig called the Frederick. And so 10 convicts were left behind to finish the Frederick, and 9 people to kind of guard them, 4 soldiers to guard them. The master shipbuilder, a guy called Hoy, the ship's drunken captain called Tor, a steward and a first mate, and so on. So 9 in all to look after 10 convicts. And they finished this brig, which was called the Frederick, but it had no sea trials or anything like that. But they nevertheless launched it into Macquarie Harbour, and the 10 convicts nicked it and sailed it to Chile. Now, I think that Jimmy Porter must have sold them on the idea of Chile, because he must have
because he'd been there.
He'd been there,
had a wife
and a
child.
kid waiting there for him. So I think
sense.
he must have said, "Oh, you'll love the beaches, the wine's terrific. You know, you're really going to like Chile." So they all headed off for Chile. Now, this was a staggering feat of navigation.
I was going to say, hang on, this is without maps,
or
sextants, or anything.
They had the equivalent of a sextant was called a quadrant.
Right.
So they could tell their latitude.
Okay.
But they didn't have a chronometer, so they didn't know their longitude.
No.
And they didn't have a map, so they didn't know where they were.
Other than the sky.
Other than the sky, they could look up for what that was worth. But what they knew, there were 4 experienced sailors among the 10, so somewhere or other this knowledge will have been with them. That the border between the northern border of Chile is with the state of Peru, and that's at about 19 degrees south. And the southern end of Chile is Tierra del Fuego, which is about 55 degrees south. So what they knew was if they stayed between 19 south and 55 south, and kept sailing east, then they'd hit Chile eventually. So by this rather random piece of navigation, they got themselves to Chile, just a bit south of the port of Valdivia, and that might have been the end of the story. But 10 guys and the ship's cat make it to Chile, so 10 blokes. 3 of them managed to get aboard an American ship with the captain's permission and disappear. We don't know where they went, but it's my guess that they finished up not very far from what we now call the United States.
Yeah.
Because in the mid-19th century, I mean, there's this polyglot shambles called America, and it was the world capital of no questions asked. So I think they would have settled in nicely there. Let's put it that way. Then the 3 others. And who says lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place? But 3 others went to. They were shipbuilders of some experience, and the governor of Valdivia wanted a whaleboat built, and so they set about building this whaleboat for him.
Right.
And it was like the best whaleboat you've ever seen, really seaworthy, lots of bells and whistles. And so they finished it around lunchtime on a Saturday, and by Saturday night they were gone in the whaleboat. And they were next seen in the West Indies 3 years later. Now, if they went if they went in the whaleboat all the way to the West Indies, then again this was a staggering piece of navigation. Because they would have had to round Cape Horn in an open whaleboat, that ain't easy.
No,
but we don't know what happened to them beyond the fact that they were seen in the West Indies 3 years later. So that left 4, 3 to America, 3 to the West Indies, 4 still in Chile. The British got after them and arrested them. And carted them back to Van Diemen's Land, where they were tried for piracy and mutiny, found guilty, and there was only one sentence available to the judge for this, and that was to hang them. And so I'm not going to tell you any more.
No. So tell me, now I'd like to know, because you've written a number of books.
Yes.
Why this story?
Well, I never go on holidays with your publisher. That's the first rule of writing. I just don't do it. But I went with my beloved publisher, Richard Walsh, down to Tasmania on a holiday, for a week's holiday. And we went first to Hobart and went to Mona, the art museum there. And then we went to the north coast of Tasmania, and then we drove down to the Gordon River, where there's a 5-hour cruise, and the Gordon River is famously beautiful. And so part of the Gordon River cruise was a visit to Sarah Island, which is now totally, deserted is a funny word, but there's nobody lives there anymore.
But you can tour it, can't you?
You can tour it, absolutely. You go, the boat drops you off there, and it takes about an hour to get round it. And so I did that, and I'd had an idea to write a book called Punishment, which I was going to write with my daughter, Anushka, who's a shrink. And I had various ideas for this, and suddenly what I was seeing on Sarah Island was a perfect illustration of all that I was interested in with Punishment.
Wow. When was this holiday?
Oh gosh, 5 or 6 years ago. Anyway, I went round and I was photographing all these plaques, and they all seemed to prove everything I wanted them to prove. And then I hit the story of the seizure of the Frederick and the trip to Chile. And this was the perfect anecdote to illustrate everything I wanted to say in Punishment. So that's how I came to write that book.
So in the writing of it, the way you've this book is a sort of book where you question a lot of facts.
Yes.
And perhaps produce some of your own.
Well, I hope not.
No. I'm only playing. That's
not.
leading me to what I want to ask you. You could have gone down the path of a fiction book, which so many do, based on fact. And it must have been awfully tempting to think about that.
I don't know how to do that.
Or having known, exactly, that's a good question. Having known what you've written in the past, perhaps it's not the way you want to write.
I mean, I could give you a mirror image of that. My mate Tom Keneally, who wrote Schindler's Ark, he says in the introduction to it that he wrote it as a novel because it's the only form he knows.
Yes.
And I mean, God bless Tom, but I can't do that.
No,
and Tom can and can do it brilliantly, but I just can't.
Yeah.
And so I wrote it the way I wrote it, which is I should talk about the sources, but Jimmy Porter, our hero, wrote 2 journals, and so that was one of the sources for the book. And the other was just the records, which are all digitized, and you can look up the official record of the convicts conduct record and so on, and say he was sentenced to this in England, and then he was tried for this in Van Diemen's Land and so on. And so you can hold all these up together and say, well, what makes sense is that picking one of these 3 versions, and so that's what I reckon happened. But I hope that in the book I've been honest enough to say, well, it's pretty uncertain what actually happened here, but this is my best shot, and away you go from there.
So given the enormous amount of work you put into this, it's clearly evident, how long did it take from that trip you went on holidays to publication?
About 5 years.
It looks
about 5 years. But I mean, I wouldn't want anybody to deduce from this that I was sort of got up from breakfast table at 9 in the morning and started writing and finished at 5 in the afternoon and did that for 5 years. I didn't.
No.
I played solitaire and did all the other things that people do.
Went on other holidays.
Yeah, absolutely. Went off on holidays.
Yeah, went down to Bustle and had some fish and chips.
Certainly did that, yes.
Nasi goreng.
Yeah, nasi goreng, yeah.
So folks, that's 10 Rogues by Peter Grose. It's a really good read, and congratulations, Peter. I think it's fantastic.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, thank you.
It's available in store at Viva Books, or you can get it at vivabooks.net. Thank you very much, Peter. It was really lovely to meet you and spend time with you.
Oh, thank you, Chris. It's been a great pleasure.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks very much, Carpool Book Review. See you next time, guys. Thanks. Bye.